As the spotlight is on the G20 meet, we are joined by Edward P. Joseph, Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS from Washington, D.C., and Andrew K.P. Leung, Independent China Strategist from Hong Kong. Thank you both for your time and for joining us for this interaction. Mr. Edward P. Joseph, I'd like to begin by asking you your thoughts on the war in Ukraine dominating talks at the G20 summit.
Yes. Okay. Well, first, let's put some perspective on this. We have to get away from this notion that the war in Ukraine put hostage every other issue, for example, development or climate change. It's not true. This India-hosted summit was successful. There was a substantive discussion of other issues besides the war in Ukraine. So this is a false notion, a false narrative that everything fell to the side because of the war in Ukraine. What fell to the side was agreement on a final communique, but that's only because of the opposition from Russia and China. You had 17 out of 20 of the countries that agreed without any equivocation that this war should end, and deplored in the strongest terms. That was the language, deplored in the strongest terms a Russian aggression against Ukraine. So we have to put this in perspective. It's not as if everything was blocked because of the war in Ukraine, and it's not as if there's some kind of even-handed split. There's no even-handed split. 17 out of 20 called it aggression by Russia against Ukraine. And we should be very clear that there's so many important issues like climate change and like rising food prices that are the result of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Please.
Mr. Joseph, your thoughts then on climate finance. It's interesting you mentioned this and how the world can battle the effects of climate change, really.
Well, we see the U.S., the European Union, they are moving forward. Countries like India and others are also moving forward in the fight against climate change. But you have the irony here. You have this economy in Russia that is 100%, almost totally dominated by fossil fuel production. That's what Russia depends on. It's really a one-dimensional economy that is not diversified like India's economy and many others to develop, for example, a high-tech sector. And under Vladimir Putin, it remains a top fossil fuel producer, and that's where it gets its revenue to finance this war of aggression that creates so many terrible effects. First, of course, the suffering of the Ukrainian people, so many killed and wounded. And, of course, rising food prices that people in countries like India and others have to suffer from, but not because of Western sanctions. Without Western sanctions, Vladimir Putin would be in control of Ukraine right now. But it's because of Vladimir Putin's decision to invade, and a decision that is backed by China. That's right. India's adversary, China, is the number one backer of Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine. Please.
Mr. Andrew, to you now. Your thoughts on the India-China relationship going forward. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, of course, met the Chinese counterpart and said the two sides have to address real problems now.
I think that as far as China and India is concerned, the tragedies that both are developing countries, both have development issues which are not on all fours with the West. For example, in how to feed the huge population, how to grow the economy, how to improve the lives of the largest populations on earth. Sort of both over 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people. So I think that there is also a lot of common grounds between India and China. But unfortunately, all these common grounds are being hijacked by a border dispute and by India's perception that China is its rival. And China is now encircling India with the so-called string of pearls, which is I think an overhype, because as far as China is concerned, India is not its enemy at all. China's biggest enemy now is the United States, and not India.
Lastly, Mr. Andrew, the IMF has said India-China will contribute more than half of global growth this year. Your thoughts on that?
As I said, there are a lot of common ground between India and China. Both are in the developing world, and the developing world is going to play a much more important role in the global dynamics. Because according to the OECD research, by the year 2035, the combined economies of the developing countries is going to exceed 50 or even 60% by 2035. According to Goldman Sachs research, the world's top 8 countries in the world in terms of GDP by the year 2075 are almost all of them are what are now developing countries, except of course the United States, which by that time, 2075, would descend into world number 3, below China and India. So you can see that there is a great, the whole world dynamics are changing in favor of what are now the developing world. And both China and India have a great role to play in terms of sustaining the development or addressing the developmental problems of the developing countries in terms of infrastructure, in terms of responses to climate change, in responses to the human development, how to improve the livelihood of millions and billions of people.
Thank you both for your time and for this interaction.